This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzanotes, and today is Saturday. That means it's time for Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. Right now we're sort of in between limited formats. Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth is still out right now, but there's not that much more to say about it, honestly. This week's episode, I ended up doing a mailbag episode because I haven't done one in a while, and because, we're in this weird in-between stage between formats. And I think the fact that people don't really want to hear me talk about Lord of the Rings that much more is evidenced by the fact that I didn't receive a single question about Lord of the Rings Limited. Said the questions are all more general limited questions, and so that's what we'll be tackling today. And the next few weeks, probably be doing some other more general limited topics as well, as I often do, especially in the summer, which is usually when we have this big lull in set releases. So let's dive right in. I've got 5 questions that I want to tackle. The first of these comes from Yoav Katz, and that question is, of all the set structures we've had for limited, 3-set block, double set block, no block, what would you say are the advantages and disadvantages of each? So if you're a newer limited player, you may not have any idea what this question is about, because we haven't had blocks for a while now. But originally there weren't blocks either. But for most of Magic's history, there were these things called blocks where several sets were released in a row that were all in the same setting and that were all at least somewhat thematically linked. And in these olden days, the limited formats would change less drastically, let's say. So most blocks had 3 sets in them. So if we talk about, original Ravnica block, first you were just drafting 3 packs of Ravnica. That's how it worked when just Ravnica was out. But then the next set came out, which I guess was Dissension or Guild Pact. I don't remember the order, but the next one came out, and then you were drafting 2 packs of one and then 1 pack of another. And then the last set came out, and you would draft 1 pack of each. So you can see that limited formats weren't changing because you were only getting 1 pack of change, generally speaking. That's sort of how it worked. Sets were also of different sizes. Like the first set in a block was always bigger. So that meant things, changed somewhat subtly. But my point in talking about all of this here, I guess, and this is what Yoav is asking, is, was that better for limited than what we're doing now? Is kind of the question. And I think the answer is mostly no. One of the really fun things about limited, I think, is that it changes, roughly every 3 months. Whatever the latest limited format is, changes about every 3 months. And these days, they change drastically. We go to a completely new setting. All the mechanics are different. Everything has changed thematically, flavor-wise. I mean, that's not always true. There are times over the last few years where it's like, maybe they should have just done this as a block. Like, I think that's the most evident with all the War of the Spark sets. And then more recently with all the March of the Machine sets that were all sort of connected, but were separate sets. Those maybe should have just been blocks. But mostly, we really changed settings completely from set to set. And overall, I think that's a good thing. Getting a completely new limited format every few months is good. If in situations where one of the sets is bad and you have to just keep drafting it for months and months and months, that's really awful. So it lets you sort of hit the reset button when things aren't good. I mean, there are definitely times where a set is so good that you kind of wish it went this way, but most of the time you're ready for something new by the time you get to a new set release. And I think things changing all the way completely every few months is better than things only changing more subtly. They also tried a 2-set block model for a while, and I think that was even more of a failure. I mean, they didn't keep it around for very long. Yeah. There are sometimes cool things you could do with blocks that I think could make them worth it. Sometimes I think the most notable example is how things changed completely with from Zendikar to Rise of the Eldrazi. And flavor-wise, it really captured like what happened on that plane because, people are just having a good time exploring. I mean, it's a super dangerous plane, even without Eldrazi, but people are exploring. It's sort of like a Dungeons and Dragons-esque set is kind of what they saw it as, having that sort of realm. But then all of a sudden, everything gets turned on its head, and all these Eldrazi show up and change everything. And when they designed this well, that sort of thing really well, it was fun flavor-wise and also fun for limited because all of a sudden the plane isn't at all what it was like before. So when they could do it successfully, it was really good. But there were lots of examples where things got stale quickly. So overall, I think what we're doing now, where we have one set, period, it's better. I also think it's easier for designers. When they're designing limited formats, they don't have to think about the previous set. And I think it makes things more cohesive in limited, generally speaking, too. So I come down on what we're doing now is better, but there were some advantages to the old model. And when it really worked, it was a lot of fun, but it often didn't. So our next question comes from Marcelo Salis. The question here is, do you think sets like Modern Masters or other reprint premium sets should be designed with limited in mind, or is it just an excuse to load them with garbage to keep chase cards price high? I think it's kind of both. Designing sets so that limited is good is, it's good. Obviously, if you're watching this video, if you watch this part of my YouTube channel, you're really into limited. And overall, you probably like that they design these sets with limited in mind. I'm probably preaching to the choir here to some extent. But I think that, having those premium sets be fun, limited sets is interesting. I mean, when they do it well, it feels sort of like a cube because, they're taking all these cards from all over Magic, shoving them into a set and making cohesive archetypes usually from somewhat disparate cards, which, that's kind of what a cube is. And they used to be pretty consistently successful. Like one of the best limited formats of all time is original Modern Masters, and that was a reprint premium set that made modern players really happy, and it was an amazing limited format. So you have, these where you can have things work out that way. But I do think definitely there is a bonus to them, throwing in some random uncommons and rares that are good for a limited format and not reprinting some other things. There's some benefits to doing that. Now, I will say, Wizards of the Coast doesn't benefit at all from chase cards prices being high. I mean, I guess they sort of do, right? Because you're more willing to continue to buy packs, I guess, if you think you can get those cards. But if you also know the set is filled with a bunch of filler for limited, your chances aren't that high. So this mostly seems like a question about the secondary market, in which case they don't really care that much. I do think, sure, they don't want to pack too many super valuable cards into packs. And some of this is to keep collectors happy. Some of this is, so they can hold on to something else to reprint in another set to make people more interested in it. There's definitely a business side of things here that plays a role. But I think designing those sets so limited is fun is important. I mean, these events have pre-releases, and for a pre-release to be fun, generally the limited format has to be good. So generally speaking, I like that they're designed this way. Not everyone likes limited, though, and the people who see these sets like we have Commander Masters about to come out right now, right? People who see these sets as, they're only interested in buying it for whatever constructed format they want to play. In this case, probably Commander, right? People who only see it that way are going to be disappointed. They're like, why did they print this like mythic rare that has synergy with a limited archetype but doesn't matter at all? Nobody wants it in Commander. Like, that's frustrating, sure. But that's one of the really fascinating things that I think they're generally successful with in Magic is most sets do enough for enough different players that most people stay happy. I mean, they're able to design things for 60-card constructed formats, 99-card formats, EDH is what I mean when I say that, and for limited. And most sets check the box reasonably well in all three, and that's a hard thing to do. So, sometimes sets are going to disappoint people, and I think that's the most likely with Masters sets because they do have that elevated price tag. People are going to be more interested in spending more money on the set if they think they're going to get these crazy chase rares. So, yeah. So that's how I feel about that. So next question comes from Dakota Pana, and it is, what is an archetype that we have rarely or never seen in Limited that you would like to see in the future? I'm sort of going to change this question a little bit to being one about, it's going to be about archetypes, but there's another archetype question that'll overlap with this a little bit. So I'm going to change this a little bit to instead talk about limited archetypes that I thought looked really interesting, but ended up not panning out at all. And I'd like to see them in the future better executed. So yeah, that's sort of how I'm going to answer this, which I think is, things we've rarely seen. In this case, these are archetypes that we've seen once, basically, and they didn't pan out. I think the biggest offender for me here, because I was so excited about it, was Lorehold in Strixhaven, which was like a really interesting take on red-white. It's the only time we've seen a red-white graveyard deck, right? And that was really interesting. Anytime I see an archetype that is just not something we've seen before, I tend to get excited about it. And I thought that was an interesting take on red-white. The Lorehold people were historians and archaeologists, so it made perfect sense that the graveyard made sense. They sift through the graveyard for evidence, the way historians and archaeologists do. But man, did that archetype not pan out at all. That deck was really, it was basically a red-white aggro deck if you were successful with it, so you just ended up doing what red-white always does in that format, and you didn't really get to do all this sweet graveyard nonsense where cards are being moved out of your graveyard and you're getting bonuses for it. Like, that is something that was a huge disappointment. Another more recent one, very recent actually, is the Lord of the Rings Tales of Middle-earth Scry deck, which has all these really sweet payoffs, but they're all so fragile. Like, the deck looked like it was going to be pretty sweet because there are so many payoffs, but they just didn't make the common and uncommon payoffs for the deck very good. I do think that deck is a little different than red-white, because if they make a Scry deck too good, there is a chance that it just takes over a format in a big way, because Scry helps you find more Scry and more Scry payoffs. So maybe they did it on purpose. They designed all these payoffs to be like incredibly vulnerable or weak, because it was going to be so easy to find them. But if that's the case, the pendulum swung a little too hard in one particular direction. Another relatively recent one was the vehicle deck in Neon Dynasty. That was like supposed to be the blue-white archetype, but it also just didn't pan out. It's the same sort of problem as the Scry deck, in that the common payoffs and the common vehicles just weren't very good. We have seen vehicle decks before, I guess. The red-white deck in Kaladesh, or one of those sets, blocks, it was either Aether Revolt or Kaladesh. It was a vehicle deck. It didn't really pan out that well either, but blue-white being a vehicle deck looked pretty interesting. The Signpost Uncommon's obviously really strong, but man, did that deck just not get there. And then the last one is basically all of the dungeon decks in Forgotten Realms. There were, I guess, 3 archetypes, color pairs that were really like, hey, you want to be venturing into the dungeon, and all of them ended up being pretty mediocre. That mechanic overall not only ended up being not powerful enough, it was also way less interesting than it looked, because you had these 3 dungeons, and it's like, oh, cool, this is some neat modality. I can pick one of these dungeons, and depending on my situation, but like 99% of the time, you chose the dungeon that had positive effects that was smaller, because generally that was better. This is because the going through that dungeon twice instead of going through the Lost Mines or whatever once was pretty much the same value. And you also had these cards that gave you bonuses for completing a dungeon, and you could complete that one a lot more quickly. So you basically never went through the big dungeon. You very rarely went into the negative effect dungeon, like if you could pressure your opponent by making them lose life or sacrifice things or whatever. So that whole thing, like that limited format is probably still the worst one in the like arena era of limited, I would say. And a big part of it, there was some color imbalance. Blue was really bad, but if it was just that would be fine. Lord of the Rings, for example, has color imbalance, but it's a good limited format. This one wasn't, because it's like chase mechanic. This would be like if the Lord of the Rings tempt mechanic didn't pan out, basically. And that is such a huge part of the format. And it has panned out, unlike this, which just ended up being a complete dud. Several archetypes ended up being weak because of it. I'd like to see them try it again a bit more successfully. And I guess to some extent in like Commander Legends, the new take the initiative mechanic was a more successful take on this, but this was still a pretty disappointing mechanic and archetype overall. So next is the other archetype question where I didn't want things to overlap too much, and that is from Sir Zapdos, which is, what have been some of your favorite limited archetypes over the last few years? Not necessarily the strongest, but the ones you most enjoyed drafting and playing. So It's been a while now, but I still think one of the most interesting archetypes that we've really only seen once, but that I think was really successful and fun to play was an Amonkhet. I guess we've had Amonkhet remastered, right? There was a -1/-1 counter deck in that format, and not the way you're thinking. Generally, you put the -1/-1 counters on your own things and got benefits from doing so. And that, I think, was some really cool tension in terms of how these cards worked. You could sort of put counters from some of these. Like you would have like Ornery Kudu or whatever. It was a 3 mana 3/4, but it put a -1/-1 counter on something, right? So you could put it on itself and you have a 3 mana 2/3, but you could also put it on something like Doom Dissenter, a 1/1 that when it dies makes it 2/2. And that feels pretty good, but you could also put it on other things that could use the -1/-1 counter for value. I also really liked I think Midnight Hunt. Was it Midnight Hunt? One of those Innistrad sets. The blood mechanic and the blood deck, I think, were really interesting. That ended up being really powerful, and I think not too powerful. I think it was a strong deck for sure, but it wasn't like busted. But this is another thing where you like make tokens and you can use them as a resource in any number of ways. You can use the blood tokens to sift through your deck, but then there are a bunch of cards that can sacrifice those blood tokens. If we go back to Kaldheim, I really love all the snow decks, basically. Those, they were pretty strong, but anytime there is a snow deck in a limited format, I think they're really interesting. We had them, I think, in Modern Horizons too. And part of what makes those so interesting to me is that you have these basic snow lands, which in most formats, the basic land slot is just like whatever. Not so in a snow deck format, because just having snow basic lands significantly upgrades several cards in your deck, because you have cards that pay you off for having these snow permanents and snow lands and snow mana around. Any format where you start taking lands, especially basic lands, that's pretty rare. So it makes the draft part pretty interesting while also being a fun to play deck. So those are the ones that like first come to mind for me. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few, so many limited archetypes these days, but those are the ones from the recent past that I think about the most, where I'd really like to see them again too. So in some ways, this answers the previous question. Like I'd love to see a -1/-1 counter deck again. That's one we've only seen once. So yeah, but those are the main ones that I think of first when I think about fun limited archetypes in the recent past. All right, and our last question isn't exactly a limited related question. It's more sort of about my Magic history. I mean, you'll see. Limited is mentioned in the question. So, Jem Volkenberg asked, I know you said in one of your videos that you mostly play draft, but before that, did you ever have a meta deck you ran back in the day? The Rock, Tron, Turbo Fog, or were you a casual player? So, yeah, since I came back to Magic after not playing for several years, I came back in 2014, I guess, after, a 4-year or so hiatus. After I did that, I've pretty much 90% of the Magic I've played has been limited. And I've liked limited for a pretty long time, since about original Ravnica, actually. It's weird that set came up again. Is probably when I really got into limited for the first time, but for a long time, I played a lot more constructed than I did limited, and I mostly went with rogue deck, wacky sort of things. When I did play limited, which was usually extended at the time. But there were a couple of more meta decks that I did play in that format. One of them was goblins. Basically just jam all the good onslaught goblins into a deck, and that was what it was. And that was a deck I played in extended for a couple of years, really. And the other one was a deck called Eminent Domain, which was a land destruction deck, which is, sort of my favorite. When I played extended back in the day, I played a lot of different kinds of land destruction decks. Some of them were like a wildfire style deck, but that one was pretty much a rogue deck. But the Eminent Domain deck wasn't. That deck gets its sort of funny name from the fact that it was a blue-red land destruction deck, and it ran Annex, which is an aura, which for 2 generic and 2 blue, lets you steal an opponent's land. So it basically ramps you a land and takes one from your opponent. So it's pretty good. It's not land destruction technically, but it basically is. So you take land from your opponent, hence the name Eminent Domain. And so that was the other one that I played, a blue-red land destruction deck, and mono-red goblins was the the other sort of meta deck that I played in Extended back in the early to mid 2000s, I guess, is when this was, like, I don't know, 02 to 05 or something like that. Other than that, I mostly played wackier sort of rogue decks when I played that format. Again, Extended, which I guess I should explain what Extended is, because it's not around anymore either. That was an older format that was a rotating format, like Standard is now, but it was much larger card pool. It was like the last 5 years of cards, but it rotated every couple of years. So that's what Extended was, if you're wondering. All right, so that'll do it for this edition of Nizzanotes. Next week, I haven't decided what it's going to be yet, but I'm going to do sort of a general topic about Limited, sort of talking about how you can maybe better your Limited game in broad terms. So that's what we'll be doing next week. In the meantime, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to see more Limited content, you should subscribe to the channel and check out, all the other Limited videos that are already on the channel. Thanks for watching.